Hello and welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast brought to you today by Fantrax. My name is Chris Crawford. Thanks so much for joining us. This is going to be a solo show. I want to issue a preemptive apology. If you hear some weird pauses, still getting over a little bit of an illness, and you might have to hear me hit the cough button or take a quick drink. It's difficult during the solo episodes to do that, but I'm going to do my very best. Today is a keeper day. Well, every day is a keeper day, I guess, but a lot of you asked me keeper questions. And I figured I would go ahead and answer them. Also, a few prospect stuff. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about the one big piece of news that we got late last night. And that is that Cody Bellinger is going to be a Chicago Cub. 3 years, $80 million, according to Jeff Passan. I think it's a good landing spot. I mean, we saw the success that he had last year. Were there better fantasy landing spots? Potentially, I guess. The Cubs have a good, not great lineup. Chicago, not the friendliest confines, but certainly not something that I think is going to keep him down. My one concern with Cody Bellinger is we have seen the bitter and the better, to say the very least. When he has been at his best, he has literally been one of the best players in baseball. When he has been at his worst, one of the worst players in baseball as well, at least offensively. He's always provided solid defensive value, solid base running value. I like it. I don't think his stock goes up. I don't think his stock goes down. Just you have to be cognizant of the fact. And keep in mind, too, that this is a guy who ranked in the bottom 10th percentile in hard hit percentage last year. Doesn't strike out, which will help for the average, and he can beat out some ground balls. It's a good landing spot. It's not a great landing spot, but I think it's a good landing spot. I think Cody Bellinger remains right around a top 50 player for 2023, or 2024, I should say. It's going to take me a while to get used to that one. Thank you so much for everybody who's joining us on YouTube right now. Feel free to leave your questions. I will do my best to get to them. We got an early one right here from Jack Inglewood. Would you keep Mason Miller for $5 in a 15-team ALNL with 5x5 with teams that can keep up to 10? Yeah, I think I would. I think Mason Miller is going to get some real save chances. I'm still hopeful long-term that he's going to be a starter. But I can see the A's just taking the safe route and giving him a chance to be that saves guy. Now, the reason this is even a question is, how many chances are you going to get for the A's to have saves? This is going to be a really bad baseball team. But because of his swing and miss stuff, and I think because the rates are going to be so good, I do think it's going to be worth keeping Mason Miller for that salary. It's not a foregone conclusion, but it's something that I think I would do. Bunch of questions about Elly De La Cruz, one in the chat and now one from my emails, and I'll keep everybody I'll keep it incognito so that nobody knows that I am doing I'm just trying to help you guys out. First question I got was, I can keep Elly De La Cruz or Gunnar Henderson in the 4th round. Which one would you keep? Boy, that's tough. Because it's, you talk about ceiling and floor, right? And I think that Gunnar Henderson has a significant ceiling. I'm not sure very many players have the same type of ceiling that Elly De La Cruz does. I'm not sure if many players have a lower floor than Elly De La Cruz does either. Like in terms of like top 50 potential draft picks, which is what you're talking about in the 4th round, right? I think I would probably go De La Cruz because I think he's more likely to help you in the stolen base and the homer category. But boy, it's close because Gunnar Henderson is a star. And I think Gunnar Henderson is going to develop into a potential 1st-round pick. If you were asking me which one had the most likely chance of being a 1st-round return this year, I would say it's Elly De La Cruz. But if you're looking for floor, which one is more likely to be a 2nd-round pick, a 3rd-round pick, and at worst, 5th, 6th? Then it's Gunnar Henderson. There is just such a wide range of outcomes for Elly De La Cruz. But I'll take the chance. I'll take the ceiling. That is a tough question to start things out, to be honest with you. But I will go with Elly De La Cruz just because I think there is a little bit more upside. A question here in the chat. Gossman for 26 or Sonny Gray for 6? It's an interesting one. I think I would probably go with Gausman. I think 26 is fair, and I just think he has a little bit better floor and ceiling. Like, I get it, $20 less. I'm not even saying Sonny Gray is $20 worse than Kevin Gausman, But I just think that that's a really good price point for a guy who has a chance to be a top 5 pitcher. I could be alone in that, but I think that the fact that you can get him for under $30, I'd be keeping that, knowing that I can probably get someone of Sonny Gray's ilk later, like in that $4 to $8 range. So that would be who I would go with. Thank you again for that question, Scott. A question from the old Twitter. Should I keep JP Crawford in the 10th round standard 5x5? No, I don't think you should keep JP Crawford in the 10th round. I wouldn't be shocked if he was a top 120 player, and that's what I'm assuming here is that you're playing in a standard league with, since you're standard 5x5, I assume you're in 12 leagues or 12 teams. You might be in 12 leagues. I know a lot of people who are in a lot more than that. I just think he's more closer to 150, 175 area. And I think you can probably get him later in drafts. If it was AL only, sure. Yeah, absolutely. 10th round, it's obviously going a lot higher than that. But assuming you're playing in a standard redraft league with both leagues applicable, I don't think JP Crawford's worth keeping in the 10th round. Nice player. Really good real-life player, even though I think his defense is overrated. And admittedly, I'm a biased Mariner fan. You guys see me wearing the spring training cap that doesn't match their uniforms whatsoever. I promise I won't go into more uniform stuff after all the stuff I did on Saturday with Ryan. But I just don't think JP Crawford, I would want a guy who could give me a top 80 potential return in the 10th round. And I don't think that you're going to get that from JP Crawford. Don't think he's going to help in the average category enough or the power category enough. And he doesn't steal bases. On base percentage league, that obviously changes too. But like you said, standard 5x5. Let's see. What do you think about Colson Montgomery and Yofuri Rodriguez? I'm not super familiar with Rodriguez, but I am super familiar with Colson Montgomery. I think he's a top 5 fantasy prospect. Approach is really good. Pretty much a lock to stick at shortstop. We're talking 60 hit, 60 power. I would not be shocked whatsoever if Colson Montgomery was playing every day for the White Sox by the end of this year. In part because the White Sox just aren't very good. But I have huge hopes for Montgomery. He is someone I would consider using with a late round pick in standard leagues. Like if you're playing in a league where you're drafting after 250, I would absolutely consider a Colson Montgomery pick. I think he has a chance to absolutely be a star. Jordan first round or Devers first round keeper? Ooh, that's a fun one. I would probably go with Jordan. I kind of think Jordan might be in for like a breakout season. Sounds weird, right? But I could see him putting up MVP type numbers. There's just so much to like about his offensive upside. I love Devers too. And the fact that he plays third base, a position that's not great, where Jordan, you're getting outfield utility. I still have to go with Jordan. I just wouldn't be surprised if this is a guy who hits 315 with 50 homers and 140 RBI. I wish he would steal some bases, but you're not getting steals from Devers, so not exactly a huge hope in that regard. I go with Jordan. I think Jordan is worth consideration as a top 10 pick this year. That is just, that offensive upside is just so palpable. Who do you prefer long-term, Spencer Torkelson or Vinny Pasquantino? So this is interesting because if we asked this question at this point last year, I think we pretty much all easily go with Pasquantino, right? Like what Pasquantino did in the minor leagues, as well as his short time in Kansas City, like suggested that he was well on his way. And Torkelson wasn't very good in 2022. And Torkelson wasn't very good for the first half of 2023. But because Pasquantino missed so much time with injury, and Spencer Torkelson was amazing at the end of the second half of last year, looked like the guy who should have been the first overall pick. I go Torkelson, but it's fairly close. Like, there's not a huge bridge between the two. There's not, if they were on a tier list, I think both would be in that same tier for the long term and the short term. Vinny Pasquantino can really hit. Now, Spencer Torkelson, more upside, definitely more upside, because we saw what the upside is during that second half of the year, right? It's a reason for Detroit Tiger fans to be excited because Riley Green and Spencer Torkelson have a chance to be pretty special offensive players, I think. But ultimately, man, I almost talked myself out of it going with Vinny P because I just love Vinny P's offensive skill set so much. The approach is so good. Good chance to hit for average. Good chance to hit for power. But ultimately, I think the upside of Spencer Torkelson is just a little too hard to pass on. Burns at 54 or Flaherty at 6 or Severino at 6. Oh, 54 is a big number. I would not be surprised if Corbin Burns is the number one starter in fantasy baseball. I'm not super high on either of those other guys, however. Like, Severino offers a huge amount of risk, and Brian and I talked about this last week, that there's just no guarantee that the Mets are going to be very good. I'd probably go Burns at 54. That's a big, big number. But Corbin Burns has a chance, I think, to be the best starter in baseball, like I said. With that stuff, playing behind that lineup, and Uncle Ted points out Flaherty's this year's Zach Eflin, comeback pitcher. It wouldn't shock me if he came back and had a very solid year. I'll root for it because he's a guy I like. I think his velocity comments are a little bit cuckoo, but I do think that he could have a comeback season and be a very solid option. It wouldn't shock me if Severino was a solid option either. 54 is such a big number, but I think it's fair for Corbin Burns. There's probably two starters I'd be willing to go over the $50 mark for. They'd be Corbin Burns and Garrett Cole. Question here from the chat. Keep Harper for $21 or Tatis for $29 head-to-head points league. Oh, boy, this is a great question. I got to think in real time, which is not great for a podcast that a bunch of people are listening to and don't want to hear me be quiet here. I'll go Tatis just because of the overall compliment, like the overall game, the fact that you're going to get help in every category. No, Mike, it's a great question. I appreciate you asking it. It's too good of a question, Mike. Come on. No. I think that I would go with Tatis for 29 just because of the overall compliment that he's going to give you. The fact he's going to help you in stolen bases. Bryce Harper really isn't going to help you very much in stolen bases. I think Tatis has a little more risk in the average category, but another great point here made by Uncle Ted, that first base is not such a shallow position where the outfield is a little bit more in terms of overall upper echelon guys. So I would go with Tatis in that situation, but if you ended up going with Harper, I certainly wouldn't call you a nincompoop. Last question before we get into the second half. Have the second pick of a dynasty draft next week. Assuming Wyatt Langford goes first, would you take Yamamoto or Skenes? Thanks. I would go with Yamamoto. I think Yamamoto has a much higher floor, but also a similar ceiling. Now, Paul Skenes is widely considered the best pitching prospect in baseball, and I totally get it. There is absolute reason for it. The numbers he put up in the SEC on top of the stuff he showed while doing it, that's tough to beat. That's really tough to beat. And I do think there is a chance that we see Skenes in 2024. It's much less, and I know we're going to see Yamamoto in 2024. Heck, we might see Yamamoto on the first or second game for the Dodgers. His stuff is special. And the success that he's had in Japan, I just think he has a chance to be a top 10 starter this year, and there's no chance that Paul Skenes is going to do that for you. I'm not even calling it a lock that Yamamoto is even close to that. I think he's an SP1, and the fact he's an SP1 who's definitely on the younger side, who has put up the numbers he has in Japan, I think you have to go with him with the second pick. In fact, I'd even consider him with the first pick. It seems like I insult Wyatt Langford on all of these podcasts. It's definitely not intentioned. He is a fantastic prospect. But there is more risk with Langford than I think people suggest. I don't think he is necessarily the superstar that people are putting him in the company of. Like, I'm ranking him below Jackson Churio. I am ranking him below Jackson Holiday. I am ranking him even-ish with Dylan Cruz still. I think Dylan Cruz is become a super underrated prospect. I get it. The fact that Langford reached AAA and that offensive upside is palpable, but I just don't think you can quite put him in that number one prospect territory. That's just my humble opinion. That is just my humble estimation. All right, I'll get to more of your questions, but first we're going to take a quick commercial break. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Are you coming from another service? Fantrax makes it easy. Fantrax can import any of your current leagues and customize if needed. They offer the most in-depth player pool in the industry, including minor league players. Do you need a customizable commissioner service for your other fantasy leagues? Fantrax offers more customization than any other platform. Waivers, categories, scoring system, schedule. Fantrax offers custom solution for all that and more. Best part of all of it, it's free. Can't beat free, man. And if you sign up for free today, you could be entered to win an official MLB signed jersey from Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Simply go to fantrax.com/RotoWire and sign up today. That's fantrax.com/RotoWire. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. I almost tried to make Vladimir Guerrero Jr. his own website there for a second. All right, let's get some questions here. My buddy Adam asks, I have a single keeper league in which I need to keep either Betts or Ohtani. I'm leaning Betts because of the positional eligibility and the fact we just don't know what Ohtani might be like as a pitcher and after another elbow operation. Oh, that's a tough one, but I still think I would go with Ohtani. The positional eligibility, though, is a great point. The fact that Betts is going to be a second baseman, I think is huge. Like, really helps his fantasy stock, and the fact you can play him in the outfield too. Man, I still think Ohtani has to be the guy. Because even if Ohtani is just a mid-rotation starter, Adam, you're still talking about the most valuable player in fantasy sports. There's some risk, no question about it, and you have to be cognizant of it. And Betts, we talk about ceiling and floor. I think that Betts maybe offers the higher floor. Except no, he doesn't, because Shohei Ohtani is a 45 to 50 homer guy who also at worst is going to be a back-end starter or maybe a reliever who really helps you in rates. I just can't keep anybody but Shohei Ohtani. I get it. I get the question. And it's a good one. I wouldn't have read it if it wasn't. But ultimately, I think you do have to go with Shohei Ohtani. Let's see here. One more. I need two of these to keep. Tanner Bibby for one, Hunter Brown for one, Evan Phillips for one. Hit the like button, people, please. Thanks so much. Whew. I would go with Bibby and Brown. Phillips is close. Phillips, I wish he was more locked into a closer situation. If that was like locked in, then for sure. But I think that Bibby and Brown, especially if this is assuming you can keep them the next year, you got to go with those two. Because I think that, and I got to stop calling him Bibby, Tanner Bibby is the guy that you have to go with. The long-term potential for this guy, what he did last year, I think was extremely underrated. Again, if it was just the closer, if you knew that Evan Phillips was going to get 30 save chances, then I'd go with him. But I'm not 100% sure you are, so I got to go with Bibby and Brown. Go by Bibby. Come on. It just makes things easier for Chris Crawford as much as you can. I was offered Nolan Jones and a 4th-round pick for Michael Harris. Would you do it? This is really close. I got some really good questions. I had to leave some off. I don't think I would. I think that there is enough difference between Jones and Harris, and it's all due respect to Nolan Jones, one of the most underrated rookie campaigns I think anyone's had, especially from a fantasy perspective. But I think Michael Harris is a star. I was really concerned about Michael Harris having a little bit of a sophomore issue, and he did for a little bit. But this is a guy who ranked in the 98th percentile in expected batting average, guys, and slugged well above average, steals bases. I hate the approach. And I also have to acknowledge that, one, you're getting a 4th-round pick. That's a really good player. And two, you are getting Nolan Jones getting to play in Coors Field. But I just think Harris has enough of a difference between the two that I can't do that trade. If it was just Jones for Harris, this isn't close, but getting that 4th-round pick, pretty close. pretty darn close, but I am a huge fan of Michael Harris, and I think that he is going to be a fantasy star for a long time. Not convinced that Nolan Jones is a fantasy star, but a pretty darn good player. A gut feel on when you think Buehler might be back in the rotation. This is a tough one because, I mean, they were talking about having this dude start at the end of the year. Now, it was mostly Buehler talking about it more than the Dodgers, right? I would guess early May, and that makes him certainly worth rostering in fantasy leagues, but there's just so much risk. There's so much risk because of that much missed time, and the Dodgers are going to be super careful with Buehler. He's a very important part of their organization. He's a very important part of what they're going to do in the postseason. I'm still drafting Buehler. I think that's probably obvious. Point is obvious, but it's very difficult. Like somebody brought up, can't trust the Dodgers with Evan Phillips. I don't think you can really trust them with what they're going to do with their starters either. So that makes it pretty difficult. Speaking of starters, somebody asks, which Mariners starter are you drafting first for redraft? So this is between, to me, George Kirby and Luis Castillo. All due respect to Logan Gilbert, who I like, but I just don't think he has quite the upside of those other two names. I'm probably going with Castillo. I think there's a little more upside in him. I love George Kirby. The fact that he just doesn't walk anyone is super underrated, and he certainly can miss bats and initiate weak contact. But I think Castillo has a little more upside. He's also, I think, going to be that opening day starter and maybe make a few more starts, certainly more than Gilbert. Of those three, I think that's pretty easy. I like Bryce Miller. I like Brian Wu. I think both guys have a chance to be long-term successful guys. Obviously, you're not drafting them over Kirby or Gilbert. But if you're asking me between Kirby and Castillo, I think I have to go with Castillo with all due respect to Kirby. All right. In a Keep Forever league, I was offered a first-round pick for Jordan Lawler. The pick will probably be between 3 and 6. Hang on or make the move. So at this point last year, I would say absolutely hang on. And it's not so much anything Jordan Lawler's done wrong. I think he's become an underrated guy. But I think that you can probably get a prospect like Lawler later, whereas it's difficult to get a pick between 3 and 6. I think I would ultimately make that deal. I think Jordan Lawler is a very solid fantasy player. I think he's going to be a successful one for a long time. But I think it's easier to acquire a prospect like Lawler than probably acquire a pick like that. Some of this would depend on format. Like, are you drafting to keep forever? Do you get to keep that? Well, you're saying in a keep forever league, so you're going to get to keep that guy for a very long time. It's close. If it's top 3, for sure. If it's top 5 or 6, maybe try to add, like get some fab or another prospect or something along those lines. But it's close, and I love Jordan Lawler. I can't believe I'm saying anything negative about him because I've had him as a top 5 fantasy prospect since he entered the league. Well, entered the professional ranks anyways. But yeah. What position do you think is the hardest to fill? Starting pitcher in our leagues always go for big bucks. Cole was for 55. What position do you feel is the hardest to fill? In some ways, I think it's catcher. But that could be a personal thing for me because if I don't get one of the top 5 guys, I'm willing to take the risk and get somebody that nobody cares about, especially in a salary cap league where you are, going to be in those $1 or $2 guys. But if I can't get someone like Rutschman, or if I can't get Will Smith or even Cal Raleigh, like that would be my floor on what I'm going to do, just because I think every year it seems like there's somebody in that 23, 24 range that ends up being a catcher one. So I'd say in that way, it's a little bit harder to fill, but starting pitching is difficult in part because guys like Cole and Burns and pitchers of that ilk go for such big cash, and it becomes difficult to for me to determine who's that next $25 guy, who's that next $20 guy. It becomes much more difficult for me than positions like first base, second base, outfield, obviously not very difficult to fill, even though, like I said, the tiers are changing quite a bit. So I would go with catcher and starting pitcher. if somebody can let me play in that no catcher league, let me know, which sounds so blasphemous because I love players like Adley Rutschman, and I think Ethan Salas has a chance to be a good one for an awful long time. But yeah, I think that would be the answer for me. That starting pitcher, because of what you said, and also catcher, partially it could be a personal thing for me. Okay, last question. Could Kyle Teel, speaking of catchers, make his debut this year? His minor league numbers are very impressive, and Boston doesn't seem to be blocking him. So, yeah, I think Kyle Teel does have a really good shot to make his debut this year. This was a first-round pick last year, and, outside of the Angels, these things usually take a little bit of time for players drafted that early. I would guess that 2025 is more likely than 2024. But you make a good point about the fact that Boston isn't blocking him. They're, all due respect to Connor Wong and the stuff behind Connor Wong, the Boston catching situation is not good, at least on the major league roster. You take a look at Kyle Teel, a guy from Virginia who I think has plus hit, above average power, above average defense, gets rave reviews for his baseball acumen. I don't think we're talking enough about him being a guy who could help in 2024. Some of this will also depend on how Boston is doing, right? Like if Wong ends up being successful and they're in playoff contention, I don't think you're going to see Kyle Teel helping them. But if Boston is in need of help from the position and in playoff contention, or if Boston just stinks, it's really easy for me to imagine him making his debut. Now, there's a lot of ways this can go if Teel does make his debut. Catcher is a position that is notorious for guys getting off to slow starts. It's a demanding position. Baseball is hard on its own, but I could see him getting off to a pretty good start too, just because of the floor that people have talked to me about with this kid. They rave about his acumen. Like I said, he's a smart guy. He's a patient hitter. The swing and miss is to a dull roar. I don't think you're going to be talking about 150, 160 strikeout guy. I also don't think you're talking about a guy who's going to hit 290 with 35 homers and driving 120 runs either. But a 270 hitter who can hit 20 to 25 homers and drive in a decent amount of runs, there's a lot of value there, especially at the catcher position. So long story short, I do think there is a chance that Kyle Teel can make his debut. I'd put it at about 30. That might be a little bit high. 20 to 30%, though, is what I would put it at. Not somebody I'm drafting either, just to be absolutely clear, but somebody that I think you have to be keeping an eye on, especially for those of us like me who tend to ignore the catcher position. All right, that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for all of your questions. I really appreciate everyone who hopped into the chat. My absolute pleasure. CMNY, really appreciate you asking your question. We are back to our schedule of having shows every single day of the week, Sunday through Saturday. So make sure you have all of your subscriptions turned on. Check out RotoWire.com, RotoWire.com/pod for those of you who want to take a look at all of the good stuff that we're doing and haven't made the subscription yet. Really appreciate everyone who has subscribed. This was a lot of fun. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks. I'll be back next week with a regular guest. Have a great week, everyone.